Hello, everyone, and welcome to Snap Take. This is Glazer of Snap Judgments, the official podcast of Marvel Snap Zone. Today, what we have for you is something completely unique that you will not find on anyone else's channel because, as far as I'm aware, no one has ever done the research for this. We are going to look at every single season since the Infinite Leaderboard has come into existence. What player finished number one on that Infinite Leaderboard, what deck they were playing primarily, and what the story of each season was. So if you're interested in Marvel Snap history, please do stick around. But before we do, please hit that sub button, like, and comment. It helps the channel a huge amount. We are trying, it's a really long shot goal, to hit 15,000 by the end of the summer. We're at a little over 12,000 now, so any extra support you can give us in getting there would be greatly appreciated. In return, we give you 7 days a week of Marvel Snap videos. In those 7 days, you'll almost always get 3 brand new decks. Every weekday, 3 brand new decks, all the new card coverage you need from top players, everything in Marvel Snap. In addition, we're giving away a season pass a week, and we give away 10 at the start of every season. So in order to win that season pass, all you have to do is comment this video. Make sure you're subbed, make sure you like, and then comment this video. Comment whether you're interested whether you're interested in the occasional historical Marvel Snap content, a look back, a retrospective. If you're interested in that, we can do something more like that every few months as a way to sort of take stock of the meta. A good way to know where you're going is to know where you've been, is at least my theory. So that's why we're doing this content. But leave that comment. One video this week's comments will yield a giveaway winner. All right, so the Infinite Leaderboard began in September of 2023, which was the Loki season. The Loki season is fundamentally where I consider the beginning of modern Marvel Snap. It's not recent, it's actually almost a year ago, but it's where I consider there was a leap in power to the new cards that were coming out. The previous month had X-23, but not much else. Legion was a power card before that. Silky Smooth was a power deck before that. At this point, we start to get modern powered decks, something significantly stronger. We're going to look at the number one player for each season and what they played. In addition to that, we also almost always have a quote from that number one player. We're going to talk about the story of the season, and I asked the question on the last slide, so we're good. All good, ready to get going with the Loki season. So season 1 was September 23, won by a player named Youngwave. Youngwave has seemingly left the game, so Youngwave is, I believe, the only player here who we don't have a quote for at all. So Youngwave is an Asia region player who finished number 1. In this season, Loki warped the meta, but does not end up number 1. So Loki comes out. Almost everyone thinks it's terrible, except Safety Blade, which I'll never let us forget, but he'll also never let us forget. Very few people thought Loki was going to actually be good. Loki was not only good, it completely warped and broke the meta, especially because we were still several weeks before Mobius and Mobius came out. Mobius and Mobius came out as the last card of that month. In addition, Loki was a 3/5 that worked with collectors, so merely by playing Loki, you were often getting like 10, 15 power collectors, largely because everyone was playing Loki. You would Loki on Loki reasonably often. Other cards that season were totally OP as well. Alioth came out the week after Loki, and then we had Loki Alioth decks, Mobius decks, and Ravonna decks. Alioth immediately started going in Galactus decks as well. That's fundamentally the story of the season. Ravonna was a bad card upon release. She was a 3/3, and the week after Mobius came out, so she didn't see a lot of play. However, Alioth and Mobius became a mainstay in every deck because it was the only way to fight Loki, like, at all. If you didn't get it down on 2, you were going to have a really long game against Loki. However, the number 1 deck didn't do any of this, so let's get to it. This is a different version of it, or rather, when you pull a deck from any of the common deck builders, they don't show you the older version, they show you the newer version. America Chavez was a 6/9. For the first several months, until America Chavez has changed, she's going to be in the top deck as a 6/9. She was a 6/9 that you could only draw on turn 6, which took away 1 draw to give you much more early game consistency. This deck had Forge as a 1/2 that gave +2 that really wanted that early game consistency. This is not the exact deck. Again, Youngwave has left the game. This is the only deck that I couldn't get the exact card-for-card copy of, but we had Forge into Brood into Absorbing Man here, and if you couldn't Forge Absorbing Man, you could Forge Mr. Sinister Absorbing Man. You can Forge either of those cards into Iron Lad for an extra chance at hitting Absorbing Man, and then just a million other good hits. Because of Loki and Collector, Shadow King was all over the place, so Luke Cage is in the deck. Luke Cage was also a really good meta call, and then you could spread power with Doom. Doom was sometimes Legion in these decks, and very rarely they would run Onslaught. Your basic gist here was that Patriot was just a ton of extra power. This was the meta deck right before Loki came out. I would have thought Loki would have chased it away, and within a season, Loki does chase this deck away. This deck has always been on the fringes of the meta since, but never been nearly as good. Onto the October season was won by Tanjo for the first time. Hint, hint. Tanjo is our friend. He's been on the podcast a few weeks ago. The October 23 season was the Elsa Bloodstone season. She released as a 2/2 that gave any card fill a +3, which quickly proved to be completely overpowered. This took Loki to another level, but Elsa did not even survive the full season. She ends up not being in the deck by the end of the season, as another card, Werewolf by Night, has come out and is extremely powerful. Once Werewolf comes out, Werewolf becomes a better stat stick than the nerfed Elsa to 2/3 +2. Loki during the season still works with Collector for quite a long time and becomes a 4/5. It is still the best deck. Galactus ends up finally re-nerfed here. Galactus was a 6/7 with Eliath, which meant when you can get it off, you would automatically win the game, which was too strong. This is also the season of the Giant Mobius controversy. The Giant Mobius controversy is fundamentally, he starts off as a 2/3 with his current ability. Then he changes to a 2/3 on reveal, and in the writing of the patch notes for Mobius, it is implied that they always knew they would have to nerf him. Since they had just sold a bundle for Mobius, and since so many people had opened for Mobius, even though he was Series 4 at start, this caused a giant controversy. They walked it back and made Mobius a 3/3 ongoing almost immediately after, which thank God, because Loki was completely freaking insane in a Mobius-free world, and we ended up in a different place. Tanjo says, in October, I just dominated the entire season with Loki, getting up to a 500 SP lead, which is absurd. That is one of the two biggest leads we are going to see in this whole list. Tanjo with Loki. Tanjo fundamentally almost always plays Loki where possible. He's finished top 5 with other things, but his best finishes are fundamentally always Loki. You can find Tanjo on twitter.com/@TanjoAnjo with 2 O's in the Tanjo. It's worth noting that Tanjo does not play tournaments, but is on ladder the most consistently successful Loki player ever, and it's not particularly close. There's a lot of great Loki players. Tanjo is, for this particular card and deck, number 1. All right, let's get to the number 1 deck. This is directly from Tanjo. This is Elsa-less Loki. You'll note that where possible, we have a screenshot of the deck, which is really nice because so many cards were changed. Although in this deck, despite its power, Collector was separated from Loki. Loki's already a 4/5, as you can see here. Werewolf goes to a 4/4, then down to a 3/1, and we have the original America Chavez. Note that Falcon, with a bunch of 1s, was the order of the day because of Beast, and that Quinjet will be in and out of the list depending on the prevalence of Mobius and how much bounce is run. Mobius chases Quinjet out, and then Quinjet goes back in, and we go back and forth a little bit, but by the end of the season, it ends up there. Now, Cosmo's here largely because Collector can be a sitting duck for a lot of Shang-Chi shenanigans. Tanjo did keep Shang-Chi. A lot of decks were cutting Shang-Chi because there were so many Loki mirrors at this point that you didn't want to give the opponent your Shang. That's what the Cosmo was for. Werewolf and Cosmo is a surprisingly good combo because the on-reveal abilities will still move Werewolf even if they don't trigger. Maria Hill was also an absolutely nuts card here because she had a chance to give you like a Collector or a Luke Cage or a Falcon or a Beast or a ton of cards that Loki really, really wanted to see. Almost all of those cards were either removed from the deck or separated from Loki. In particular, Luke Cage and Elsa were moved up to 3, while Collector no longer works with Loki. All right. Next season is November of 23, and this is won by the great Lambie series, the all-time GOAT of Marvel Snap. However, there was controversy. Let's talk about that before we talk about how the Ms. Marvel season worked and what the Ms. Marvel season meant. This is the first major Infinite Leaderboard bug. In terms of resetting, when the Infinite Leaderboard resets at the end of the season, everyone's supposed to be set back a semi-similar amount. Lambie was barely, if at all, reset, while everyone else ended up being renormalized properly, which means that from day 1 to the end of the season, Lambie was dominant. However, despite this, Jeet phenomenal player, famous for his Phoenix Force decks, finished in second place, almost catching Lambie. Got it? Because of that, we're going to honor Jeet as well as Lambie. Lambie is the number one player this season, but Jeet is, we're sort of saying, the co-number one, at least honorary number one. Ms. Marvel season, it means that we've had 3 straight season pass cards that are crazy strong, and all 3 end up being nerfed within 2 seasons. Ms. Marvel actually took the longest to nerf. Ms. Marvel was a 5/5 that only needed 1 card with a unique cost in each location to give her ability before, which was just a lot. So, Ms. Marvel is great, and we start to get lockdown decks. W creates this deck that runs Alioth and Ms. Marvel as a lockdown shell, and immediately becomes fairly dominant with that deck. That deck becomes the meta deck, even if it doesn't end up in place 1 or 2. Annihilus is also released during the season, and Annihilus begins to lurk as a major powerful threat to the meta. Annihilus starts to become powerful, but because Alioth is everywhere, because Loki is everywhere, we're not seeing it near the top yet. It starts to climb, but it takes a little while to find the right ability for it. It still has a really high win rate, almost off the bat, according to Second Dinner. Before we get to the number 1 decks, we've got our Lambie quote. Lambie says, "You need to disclaimer my number 1 was on the back of Screwed Up MMR. But that was also because I was top 5 the previous months. Top 5 the previous months. So it kind of counts. I'll never take credit without full disclosure. It's worth noting that the first season of the Infinite Leaderboard, Lambie in the previous meta really preferred Conquest to Ladder, because Conquest is a really fun game mode if you're trying to be competitive, and Ladder is an uncompetitive mode, right? So Lambie played that the first season, then the second season, he ends up grinding into the top 5 of Ladder as he realizes that's where all the good players are, and that's where the best competition is. Lambie, of course, being an extremely kind and honest person, wants to give full disclosure and full credit. He earned his number 1, but there's no way to know for sure if he would actually have gained that number 1 were he properly reset. You can find Lambie on Twitch at LambieSeriesTV. Jeet says getting rank 1 is a grind more than anything else. It's not about the deck you use, it's about who plays the most games in the season, since most players at the top are that good. Now, this is going to be extremely important. As we look forward, we're going to actually hear a couple of players talk about how often and how much they played to be number 1. I personally play about 1.5 to 2 hours a day, depending on what's happening in my life, and I sit around top 500. What is the difference between being good and sitting top 500 and sitting top 100 or top 10? Partially play, partially discipline, partially playtime. We're going to take a look at that later. Jeet is one of the most important players in Marvel Snap. You can play him, you can find him in the Lambie series Discord. They're good friends. However, he has stopped playing Marvel Snap, at least for the time being. The Lambie deck that finished in first was this Loki bounce deck. This is Loki by Night. It is very similar to the previous season, right? We still see America Chavez, we still see Maria Hill, we still see Collector and Loki. What we've done, however, is we've started to add a little bit more bounce. We have the 1/1 Forge that gave +2, which was always a silly idea. We've added a little more bounce because if you can reuse that Forge multiple times, you're just getting all sorts of power, and this deck is fundamentally built around Werewolf. Rogue has now replaced Werewolf by Night because we're in a Ms. Marvel meta. The Ms. Marvel meta means that Rogue has extra value as a way to make sure that various nonsense doesn't bother you. You could win with this list, honestly, fairly easily without ever playing the card Loki, because Werewolf by Night was the best stat stick in the game, and then you had Shang and Rogue otherwise to win the game. Shadow King was seeing a little less play at this time, although it probably shouldn't have been, to be completely honest, because it was such a dead card against the various Ms. Marvel lockdown decks that were all over the place. The other deck is, in my opinion, the single most impressive deck to finish at the top in this list. This is Jeet's Phoenix Force list. When I asked him which list exactly he played, he sent me to his document. He has a very famous Phoenix Force document. At this point, remember, Forge was a 1, Hulkbuster was a 3. I don't believe Doctor Strange was in the original deck. I think that was actually a change. However, Kang was in and out for real with Alioth. It was a toss-up between Alioth and Kang was played in that last spot. Jeet wrote the famous Phoenix Force document. It's like a 30-page document that explains all the ins and outs of the Phoenix Force as it worked prior to the recent move change, where move now always happens first. There used to be all sorts of things you can do with moving, then playing a card like Ghost Spider, then moving the second Phoenix Force, and then playing like a Doctor Strange, and what would get pulled and when and how many and so on. And it was very, very, very complicated, but that is no longer the case because of the change to move, and I'd assume that's part of why Jade left the game. However, this Phoenix Force list is completely silly and very, very powerful. All right, December was another season of what would be controversy, where Sizer and Zunes are not such kind people. Zunes is the, at the time, 14, now 15 Marvel Snap phenom. He's Taiwanese, absolutely stellar player. Sizer has been at the top of multiple seasons. This is his only number one. He's a friend. He was on the podcast this last week, so if you want to hear Sizer talk about how to play Marvel Snap and what the best things to do are, please check out Sizer's podcast with us. Now, let's talk about the controversy before we talk about Sebastian Shaw. Here's what happened. If you play enough games on the Infinite Leaderboard, the leaderboard stops updating. It's one of the many bugs with the Infinite Leaderboard. However, Sizer had screenshots with both time and snap points that showed him to be number one. However, the leaderboard at the end showed Zunes as number one because the damn thing is bugged. It was a difference of 3 whole snap points, literally one game. Sizer and Zunes spoke about it. I introduced them. Sizer and Zunes spoke about it, and they decided to both accept that they were both number one, and rather than disagree about it, which I think is really, really cool and really fine by everyone, right? Shaw as a season pass card was finally a balanced one. Shaw has been a very good card for a long time. Surfer has been getting better and better as more 3s are released, and Shaw is very often a staple in that deck. But compared to the previous season pass cards, he is tame, thank goodness. Lockdown list, the Guardians Lockdown continues through this season. Ms. Marvel would not be nerfed until the end of the next season. And now Annihilus has become this sleeper deck to stop Loki, as Loki finally falls off a little bit. You'll see with all... both of the decks, Annihilus is not one of these top decks. However, you'll see with both of these decks that Annihilus is being reined in. Blob, however, does release this season, and all of a sudden we have Thanos. Thanos is everywhere. Thanos will become the meta threat for like the next 4 months. We're going to see just Thanos over and over and over again as this powerful deck that people are really struggling to stop. It is, again, worth remembering that Blob originally was a 6/3 that ate the whole deck. So it would just get as big as it possibly could, which meant we're often seeing 30, 40 power blobs, which is insane. Loki could not compete. According to Second Dinner, Thanos wasn't even the best blob deck. The Living Tribunal deck had better stats. Whatever way you look at it, Blob was a problem and immediately became the best card. However, it was not in the best deck until after it was nerfed, as a matter of fact. We're going to hear from Zunes later, but Sizer says reaching rank 1 in Marvel Snap while quarantined with COVID was a silver lining, turning my isolation into a thrilling journey, allowing me to play 8 hours a day easily. Number 1, 8 hours a day. It's also worth noting that Zunes has competed in seasons where he is off from school, and while I don't know a single thing about Zunes' life outside of Marvel Snap, Zunes is also free to play, which is 100% worth knowing, as he will be a repeat number 1 here. But Zunes is completely free to play and competes when off from school. So I think that the amount of time needed to play at the top of the meta is seemingly great, because Sizer is playing 8 hours a day. My lockdown deck was designed to counter the popular pre-nerfed Ms. Marvel and Thanos blob decks at the time. You can find Sizer streaming basically daily on Twitch at Sizer2654. Please do check him out. Just a quick shout to Sizer. Safety watched him stream, the great Safety Blade, creator of the Slayer Blade deck, top 10 player, Marvel Snap, just head of like literal number 1 on the Australian part of the leaderboard fairly regularly. He watched Sizer play, messaged me, I think Sizer's the best player I've ever seen. While I don't know if I agree, he's certainly in that conversation. Check him out. All right. Zunes number 1 was this Black Knight list. This list became famous in the meta. It is a Sarah Miracle list that also runs Black Knight. This is the point during the season where Black Knight was buffed to his shard not being able to be destroyed or have its strength reduced, which meant that if you can get off, Black Knight, you were in great shape. Outside of that, we had the counter card Shang-Chi and Ms. Marvel as a way to put, remember, 4/5 Ms. Marvel only needed one card. So you can make a 17 power lane with just a Shard Magneto there. You can Shang anything the opponent's trying to do. This is also the point where Gladiator is buffed from a 3/7 to a 3/8 and starts becoming just a really great meta card because we haven't gotten quite enough powerful threes to push him down yet. Zabu is at the height of his Zabuiness here. He will end up being nerfed to a 2/3 on reveal with a further change coming later. Most of this list has remained the same. Black Knight was nerfed, but far after. This list has just become less consistent as other more powerful things have come out. In particular, Thanos sort of chased this out of the meta as Thanos got better and better. Sizer had this #1 deck. I called it exclusive because at the time, Sizer wasn't content creating, and we were the only people who Sizer gave this list to. So we got Sizer's list exclusively at the time. It was running the 4/5 Ms. Marvel and the 6/3 destroy all cards here as long as you have priority with Alioth. The priority of Ms. Marvel and Alioth thing worked really well together. The idea here was you win a lane with Storm, and then you choose between Doom and Alioth in order to close the game out. It was insanely strong. Now, Echo, let's talk quickly about Echo. Echo became a meta card around this time, because around this time, Hella Enjoyer starts to take the meta by storm. This is the season where that group of Hella Enjoyer Woody, Husky Puppies, also on the podcast this week, started rising to prominence, and the first thing Hella Enjoyer really made popular was the ongoing Tribunal deck. That's the Tribunal deck that would consistently get out Iron Man, Onslaught, and Living Tribunal. One of the ways to counter that was Echo in one lane. At that point, you had at worst a 50-50 that Alioth would win you the game. So far, so good. This list was extremely strong and extremely specific to its meta. I don't think this is one of the strongest lists we're going to see, outside of the Phoenix Force, which is just purely only G could play. This is one of the lists with the lowest point ceilings that are going to hit the top of the Infinite leaderboard. However, excellent play and COVID led to it being #1. If you'd like to see gameplay for the decks that we feature here on the channel, please check out the stream team. Every single day, 7 days a week, we have someone streaming. Gregor2424 on Monday, Prashaun on Tuesday, GamingwithFlashX on Wednesday, Parry Manilow on Thursday, Tuccrr on Friday, FaThorNewman on Saturday, and the KingofCanada on Sunday. The day after each streams, they'll release a video on their YouTube with gameplay from the day. So please do remember, check it out. I think you'd be really interested and enjoy it. Okay, January 24 is our friend .geo. Season 5 of the Infinite Leaderboard was won by .geo. This is the Scar season, and Scar and Kyra basically immediately go into Thanos. The meta becomes all Thanos all the time, as Lockjaw is still a 3, will be nerfed before the end of the season. Lockjaw, Scar, Thanos is everywhere. Tori-kun creates a list and looks like he's going to run away with #1 until that nerf, and .geo ends up overtaking him, as do several others. Loki is finally not the top thing to do, but Thanos is completely oppressive until the Lockjaw nerf, and then again almost immediately after. However, the counter to Thanos at this point is the long-lurking Annihilus. Annihilus ends up being able to overtake Thanos. Annihilus has been just below the top of the meta since release, and finally comes up. The #1 deck we will look at momentarily, but .geo says Thanos was already super strong, but this deck had no counter at all. Bounce with the pressure of Annihilus and the tech to counter pretty much everything. The battle for #1 was until the last minute against no one other than my friends, Pogi Bonzi and Lupo Snappa. The Italian meta was different. That was the last grinding season for us. So .geo, the whole Italian meta fundamentally grinded like 5 or 6 of the top 30 ended up Italian meta players. It was these 3. Comi's was also top 10. There were a few others at that point. Googly, who seems to have quit Marvel Snap, unfortunately. Googly was in the top 20. It was insane. The whole Italian meta was playing similar decks and just grinding to the top. .geo you can find on Twitter at .geo. He said he was going to start streaming, but then he never did. All right, the #1 deck of this season was this Werewolf Annihilus deck that, honest to God, was only really nerfed by the Beast change. Although, eventually Thanos just kept getting cards and sort of overtook this. Well, okay, Sentry at this point is nerfed too. But Thanos just kept getting cards to the point where, and Forge ended up at 2. That hurts a lot too. I'm going to try this again. I feel like I should try this again. Zabu, you can't try this again. That's the change. I knew there was one that killed this deck. The Zabu change, meaning you can't just run Shangan Enchantress as free rolls, is what ends up breaking this list. Unfortunately, if Zabu comes back, I will happily try this list again. But this list was extremely strong and really frustrating to play against. Everyone was promoting this as one of the best things to do. It was never quite as strong as Thanos in most players' hands, but Werewolf, who you can still play on 3 with Zabu, was insanely strong. And then you ended the game with whatever tech card you needed, and then a bunch of cheap stuff to play. You send over a bunch of junk on their side of the board so they couldn't make all their power plays they wanted, and you'd win. This is the final hurrah for Forge as Forge gets nerfed pretty much immediately after this. And it takes a few more months of Annihilus being dominant in different shells. This is the highlight of the bounce shell for Annihilus. But if Annihilus ends up powerful in different shells until finally Sentry is nerfed. And then the current meta with cards like Sersi and filling up the board with just insane power have made Annihilus a much less powerful play. Next up, we have the BBAK season. So that is the season where Black Swan arrives. Black Swan is the only bad season pass card that they have released in this time period, I think. We'll double check that fact as we go forward, but I'm pretty sure Black Swan is the only season pass card they released that does not find a place in the meta, at least some decks. Despite no Lockjaw, Thanos is still clearly the best, as we just get more and more Thanos cards. Corvus Glaive starts ending up in some Thanos lists. We end up with just a ton of Thanos. This is also the, in my opinion, absolute highlight of competitive Marvel Snap, as both the Johnson Cup, which is a sort of country, sort of team-based tournament where all the best players competed to see who is the best. At this point, Italy is dominant. Italy wins, honestly, fairly comfortably. And we also have the World Championships, which were hosted by SnapFan, but they had 1 million qualifiers in terms of smaller tournaments. So all the best players played in that. Comis ended up winning, finally, in the finals, another Italian player who is genuinely fantastic. It's a shame that we've seemingly lost that meta. The big 2 changes, there's 2 new decks here. Corvus Glaive comes out in the middle of the month, and all of a sudden, Hela is all over the place. Hela, it goes from this sort of side meta piece as Husky Puppy starts to rise to prominence, as Hela is now just a meta deck, a thing people are doing in order to compete at the top levels of Marvel Snap, until it finally had to be nerfed. Literally, they made Leech a 4, at least partially, to get rid of Hela and Annihilus. And then, they finally had to just give up and nerf Hela. Revis Sarah also comes out and becomes one of the top decks, one of the highest win rate decks right around now. This is a Sarah deck that Revis created. There was a giant controversy in Marvel Snap because Cozy shared it without deck credit. That became a huge issue. Cozy claimed he created it on his own. It was a controversial few days in Marvel Snap. This also was around the time, and correct me if I'm wrong on the exact timing of this because I did not have the date for it, I couldn't find it, of the Marvel Snap Conquerors controversy. There was a Conquerors Winter event where Second Dinner invited fundamentally a bunch of different creators, but only one woman, and a few players ended up stepping down, one due to timing and one being Cam Best due to this specific reason, in order to get more women in the actual tournament. And it was this incredibly moving moments of Marvel Snap solidarity, which is great. Literally a month-ish after the Revis controversy, a few weeks after the Revis controversy. BBAK's first place teaches me a lesson in particular, but let's read his quote first so we can add it context. I played a lot of Thanos before the last week of the season. I think I was the best Thanos player at the time. He did not play Thanos at the end. The Thanos decks at this point were running largely Mobius. So far, so good. The Thanos decks at this point were running almost entirely Mobius. Despite this, and despite Thanos being the thing everyone had, BBAK ends up taking a Mr. Negative deck that we'll look at momentarily to the top of the Infinite leaderboard. That's impressive for numerous reasons, but most of all, it taught us a lesson that even when Thanos was the most popular thing, and it was edging on 20 to 30% of the meta, that's still 1 in 3 to 5 games, right? Which means if you can consistently win a lot of cubes in those other games and effectively retreat when they Mobius you, you're still going to be able to climb. The last week of the season was Mr. Negative, and it dominated. BBAK is one of the many players with claims to being the best Thanos player. We have BBAK, we have Crazy, who would be my pick right now because, well, you'll see why in the coming slides. We have the Great Lambie series, we have Torikun. Thanos is a deck with a lot of top players. You can find BBAK on Twitter at BBAK_snap. The deck that BBAK ended up finishing number 1 with was Mr. Negative. This was the BBAK negative list. Only one card has changed if you wanted to update this list. Zabu would just become Psylocke. It makes the list a little weaker, but honestly, not significantly so. Everything else here is relatively straightforward here, right? If the opponent wasn't stopping you, you can Wong Panther Zola. You could also negative and then go Wong Null Zola nonsense. Or sorry, Null Zola nonsense. Jane would get you cards like Null, Zola, Mystique, Iron Man, and Ironheart, which was just a lot of power. Ironheart's here sort of as your backup Wong play. Everything here is fairly self-explanatory. Note, no magic in the list. Magic has always been a dangerous card that can lose you a lot of cubes, and this list is trying to be clear and concise in its snap and retreat patterns and not lose a lot of cubes. All right, the March season. We have our first Crazy M snap season. Crazy wins the March season. This is the season of Hope Summers. Thanos has become hit critical mass of just being the stupidest thing ever at this point. To me, this is the start of modern card design where almost every card they release is powerful. Last season is the borderline, but they said they were going to make changes to card design and card testing during around the Elsa season when they were releasing things that were just broken and needing to be nerfed. Between September and December, almost every card was nerfed or buffed, changed in some way. Meanwhile, the cards after that have been all but worth owning and very rarely changed. So this is the start of that in March. This is going to end up being the last Thanos season of dominance, which is immediately going to make Loki great again. The second Thanos blob is gone, Loki is back as a powerful thing to do, which we'll see going forward. The Annihilus deck remains super competitive with a high win rate, as do various sleeper Darkhawk decks. Darkhawk is pretty good against Thanos. The meta diversifies, but Hela becomes this huge combo piece that becomes the Boogeyman. Thanos and Hela were for a time the Boogeyman cards of Marvel Snap that people just didn't want to see. Also, Mockingbird arrives and brings new archetypes with her as she starts to fall into just a ton of decks. She starts to go in like Brood Surfer as Surfer takes a leap up. We start to see various shells with Mystique in her, so on. Crazy says very simply about this season, my Thanos deck was broken. That Thanos deck is right here. It had, again, the 6-2 Eliath, which was the priority kill a lane. It had the Professor X Cannonball thing, which it could enable going turn 4 into turn 5 by running both Psylocke and obviously the Time Stone. Hope Summers is in the list as a powerful piece. Mobius to stop any Loki BS. This list was utterly insane and is among the most powerful things we've seen on this whole list. Going back to those original Loki lists, this is like the next most powerful thing we've seen finish number 1. And it's completely debatable whether this or those Loki decks is better. This has Mobius, so in a head-to-head, but however, which was better into their meta. This is the scourge of the meta. Crazy became the best Thanos player. He sort of burst onto the scene. He's obviously been playing a while to have this collection, right? But he bursts onto the scene during the Johnson Cup as, like, his team does not win. He's on the same team as Sizer, but his play is amazing throughout that tournament as the team went pretty far, and yeah, this is killer. That's not all we're going to hear from Crazy, though, because Crazy is the only player to ever go back-to-back. No one else has ever gone back-to-back, although Tancho has come close several times. This is the Baron Zemo season, as we finally get a mill season. Thanos is finally sort of gone. Crazy says it was tough. I play 48 hours a day to achieve number 1, Infinite. Thanos Corvus was the start of my content creation on Twitter, but it was killed by Thanos starting in hand. Next season, we get the nerf to Thanos, where he starts in hand, which eventually kills that deck. But the number 1 deck was going to be that Crazy Thanos. You can find Crazy on Twitch at CrazyMSnap. He also streams all the time, and he's another one of the best players I've ever seen play Marvel Snap, so you should 100% check it out. In order to be number one, and I mean this very seriously, the amount of time is absolutely crazy, no pun intended. 4 to 8 hours a day of Marvel Snap is a ton. That's a full-time job of playing Marvel Snap. However, partially because of the reps and partially because of their brain, the very best players play at a different level. Every single player that's hit number one, with the exception of the first season, Young Wave, who I genuinely don't know and have never seen play, is a top-notch player who plays at a level that is well beyond even anyone in the top, like, 1 to 500. All right, so it also is worth noting that Crazy ended up climbing to one. He started the season and ended the season with the same deck, but he lost that number one in the middle of the season and climbed back to number one with Mill. This is a Mill that ran Dr. Octopus, Professor X, and Cannonball. You know the list. It's still in the meta. It's no longer nearly as good because Arishem's a card. But the list that started and ended the season as number one, the list that was played the most games net total, is Crazy Corvus Thanos. This is a very similar list to the previous list. Yes, what it does is it says I can't do the Professor X Cannonball thing consistently, so I'm going to do Corvus and Hela instead, because this is the change to the time stone. So you just start doing Corvus and Hela instead as a way to just say, I'll just cheat out all my power that way. Corvus's ramp is good enough with all these giant cards. This deck no longer works partially because Thanos starts in hand and the stones have changed, but also partially because Hela giving -2 to stones is absolutely backbreaking, which separates those cards completely. This list was supposedly, all the content creators said, terrible. The stats did not agree, nor did Crazy, as he was able to, again, both start and end the season in number one with this list. Next up, we have May 2024, as we're one season away from this one. We've got June, and then we're in the middle of the July season as of recording. So this is the Blink season. Blink ends up an incredible card, and Blink starts off being the meta card, largely because it's a leech season at the start. This is, so at this point, Second Dinner has sort of pulled back a little bit on OTAs, in that patches no longer contain OTAs, which means we're getting 2 changes to cards a month instead of 3, which means that they seem to be taking bigger swings with changes, as we get this like 2-week period of Leech being a 4/2 and being completely freaking insane with Blink. This chases away fundamentally almost every meta deck, and we get a wildly different meta. However, Leech ends up nerfed in the middle of the season. Loki and good stuff begin to really exist as Sasquatch and Mockingbird become a pair. This is the start of Safety's Slayer Blade deck. The Ravonna, Professor X Cannonball, not yet thena Cannonball deck begins to exist, but it doesn't end up meta. As always in times of transition, Loki rises. The number one deck is played by Tanjo, and you should know, if you've been paying attention, that Tanjo is Loki. In May, I had a very fun battle with Sizer and a much tougher time having to adapt to the meta and play the right tech cards. The meta was very, very shifty in May. Things felt like they were changing on almost a day-to-day basis before we ended up back at Loki as the number one deck. You can find Tanjo on Twitter at TanjoAndro still. All right, the number one Loki of the season is a very modern deck where nothing has been touched. This is being recorded before Thursday's OTA, so if Mockingbird ends up touched, keep your fingers crossed that Mockingbird ends up touched. But this list is incredibly powerful, incredibly consistent, very simple. It is saying I'm going to run Loki and all the tech cards, and if I can't win with Loki, I'll win with the tech cards. That's it. Hopefully, if you're lucky, if Cable or Coulson go right, you have a nice 3-cost Mockingbird. You've Red Guardian something, right? You can play some powerful cards to end the game when you don't Loki, but this one's just trying to win on Loki. Again, Tanjo is the best Loki player, no matter what Loki is doing at the time. I would not take anyone's Loki play over the great Tanjo. Finally, we're at our next season. This is the only other season with like a 500 snap point lead. Zunes won the previous season, June 24, for his second win. This is the Gilgamesh season, and it's broken completely into 3 parts. The season begins with the Slayer Blade meta. The Slayer Blade meta is the Professor X Cannonball everywhere all the time. It is the best deck. Thena comes out at the start of the Gilgamesh season, slots neatly into that deck, and it feels like it's nearly unbeatable, although the top players were playing counters to that deck. After that, for at least a week or so, Gilgamesh became the top card. Gilgamesh gets buffed to a 5/9. Professor X gets nerfed to his current ability, where cards can move into that location, and Gilgamesh becomes the meta. Gilgamesh becomes the zoo meta, which is something that I did not have on my board. In the end, we end up with a weird good stuff soup, which is like a version of the Professor X deck that runs Mockingbird and Sasquatch as its top end instead of the other cards, and keeps Juggernaut as a way to just steal a lane. It keeps Iron Man because it adds Iron Man because it has Ravonna and so on. That list ends up being the best for like a week, but then arishem arrives the first week of July, but the last week of the June season because of the July 4th American holiday, and shakes everything the hell up. However, arishem is not going to appear. It is very likely to appear in the July, which is not part of this video, leaderboard, because about I know of, about 7 of the top 10 players right now are playing arishem decks. So unless there's a nerf, one would assume that that is going to finish at the top. Zunes says, the process of reaching number 1 is very difficult. It not only takes a lot of time, but also requires strength. About 80% of the time I use my phone is Snap, which is wild. Think about how often you use your phone. 80% of the time that Zunes, 15-year-old prodigy, uses his phone at all is playing Snap, including practicing and watching other people's live broadcasts to learn how to play. This requires a lot of attention. There's enough passion for this game that otherwise wouldn't be possible. You can find Zunes on Twitter at Zunes0122. Zunes is absolutely stellar and finished the last season with a deck that we've talked about recently on this channel, this Darkhawk Surfer list, which is fundamentally saying I'm going to beat arishem and have good play into everything else. The deck combines the power of just being able to Darkhawk Mystique against arishem and with Cosmo to protect it, with the ability to just play a powerful Darkhawk at like 11 power with Silver Surfer for regular matchups. 11 power Darkhawk with Surfer often ends up game winning, especially with Brood and Rockslide on the board. Nocturne for some control, and Cosmo to mess up opposing nonsense. Meanwhile, Mockingbird is very rarely better than a 3/9 here, but hey, that's a 3/9, right? Like, think about how much power that is, how much work you have to do to get Sebastian Shaw, who is with a Surfer buff, a 3/8 to that power level. This list works incredibly well, and it's incredibly powerful. It maintains a 60% win rate into the current, oh my god, all arishem all the time meta. That's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you're interested, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/snapjudgments, where we have all sorts of exclusive content. And if you would like, certain tiers of support come with on-air thanks in the form of me saying your name at the end of the video. So I'd like to say thank you to Abigail Gieslin, Mandatory Burnout, Cables, Irregardless, David G. Wingfield, Dire Wolf, LAB, FaThorNewman, Good Dog Gamer, This Is the Way, Inc., I Am Frostman, Jay Nevreeds, Doomer, Prime Ryan of Prime to Mind fame, check out the app, Caretixley, Koiray, Pyrofroze, The Goat Seeker, Denman Falcon, Quid Pro Joe, Doc D, Fat Nick, Ginger Prime, Philip Rakovich, Haplo, Kenny Loggins of the Danger Zone, Rob Silverman, The Bizza, X-Force V, and Skippy G. Winner of Snap Judgments League, our giant tournament. Snap Judgments League Season 1 winner, Tommy Nyquist. The King of Bros, Black Dahlia, The Great Kazoo, Jessica Gamble, Ryan Wood, Kev Cihoda, Luna Chris, Archangel 3K, John Q, Louis Antunes, my former student, Models, Mod Supreme, Darth Tater, Rema Setala, Brian Kaufman, Tristan H. Martin, Jason B., JD McDonaldinho, The Fuzzy Dunlop, Spectrumix, Matt H., Mikey Hijinks, NoFlex, Ocularis, Greg Sterry, Seamus, Jonesy, Two Ties, The Great Lauren Whatevs, The Pirate King Tuccrr, The Homie Min, and of course, Gunny T, where the T stands for. Thank you for watching. I hope you found value and were interested. in this long look through Marvel Snap history. Peace.